Jane's latest flick, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma, features another show within a show, or in this case, a film within a film. Actually, a film series within a film that also strangely cuts away around midway in the film to portray almost the entirety of this original film within a film's plot. I digress though. The main plot of Teenage Sex and Death centers around Chris, a young queer poly filmmaker who has been tasked with resurrecting a long dormant and quite problematic old IP named Camp Miasma. Camp Miasma was a series of films that took place in the late 80s into the 90s and centered around a trans identifying killer who would emerge from the lake and gruesomely murder every ill fated counselor tasked with working at the treacherous Camp Miasma. If this sounds a little like Friday the 13th meets Sleepaway Camp, that's because it kind of is. This film is brazen in its pastiche and referential nods to horror cinema of the 80s and 90s. It doesn't wear these tropes, though, like a spoof. There is no punching down, but rather these ideas and references all exist to build a world that seems vaguely reminiscent of the one we already live in. The film begins with this fantastic montage highlighting articles and VHS covers of the Camp Miasma series. From its well received box office busting debut, the endless sequels, reboots, sending the killer to space, and eventually ending with the film being remembered fondly but cautiously. There's a sense throughout the film that we, the audience, are not supposed to like these movies, even though we've never seen them. We're not supposed to like them because they're transphobic, soaked in sex that only appeases the male gaze, and are a little more than gratuitous blood soaked romps that exploit and titillate the audience. But like Chris, the film's heroine and central character, we can't help but find something to love about the problematic, proverbial trash cinema of our youth. Teenage Sex and Death is not a horror film. It's a movie centered around horror, but more the idea of horror and what that idea means to the culture at large. Sure, there are a few creepy scenes, as were present in Jane's previous work, and there are copious amounts of silly blood, but like no one really watches Friday the 13th Part 7 to be scared. No one is actually watching this movie to feel a sense of unease that comes from some of the most successful horror films. Instead, this film is successful in so many other ways. This movie, one about the idea of horror movies, wants to challenge not only why you watch horror films, but also why they can become so all-consuming. Why people still line up every year to visit the original Camp Crystal Lake. Why people still shriek in horror at Leatherface in a 50-year-old movie, and why Linda Blair is still a household name all these years later. Many of these films, especially ones like Sleepaway Camp that Teenage Sex and Death are blatantly paying homage to, are incredibly problematic by 2026 standards. But what Teenage Sex and Death wants to do is not make you feel ashamed for still loving those types of movies. It will point out the flaws in them for sure, but it also wants you to take a deeper look at yourself. Why you find that so tantalizing, and rather than shun it, it wants you to embrace that feeling. More than anything, this horror coded homage film is a movie about sex and orgasms. Our lead character, Chris, spends most of the film hanging out with Billy Presley, the final girl from the original Camp Miasma film, trying to both convince her to return for this reboot she's working on and to get a glimpse into what made her character so special in that first film. The final girl is a specific trope in these types of horror movies. It's one I won't go into in great detail here, but Teenage Sex and Death does a great deal of work trying to sort of recontextualize the idea of a final girl. And this isn't entirely a new thing. We've seen the final girl change shapes and forms throughout the years, and even turned on its head in films like Ty West X and Pearl. But rather than just playing with the idea of a final girl, making something new out of material that's so well trodden, Teenage Sex and Death asks us to examine why a final girl is so appealing. why we fetishize them, and what we can learn about ourselves from that fetishization. There's a great scene about midway through the second act where Chris and Billy sit down together to watch the first Camp Miasma film together. Throughout the film, Chris can't help but point out all the problems with this film that took place 40 plus years ago. She states that this part is problematic or this person here is transphobic until finally Billy, played exquisitely by icon Gillian Anderson, says, "Oh, shut up," and rolls her eyes at the precocious young auteur. It's a line and scene that, in my opinion, perfectly frames the entire premise of the movie. Yes, these movies we love, they have problems. Maybe they couldn't be made today in our current political or social climate, but that doesn't mean we have to continuously be ashamed or point out how much better we are than these things that we've deeply connected with for decades. A great documentary came out of the film festival circuit a couple years ago. I think it's on Hulu or maybe Prime or something. It's called Chasing Amy. This documentary is about a young queer director who is struggling with their identity, and they set out to dissect and recontextualize not the movie Chasing Amy, but how a movie like Chasing Amy, one that by today's standards contain a lot of problematic characters and lines of dialogue, how that movie could mean so much to this youth who was questioning her sex and identity at the time. Part of it was representation, that feeling of being seen that was so hard to find in any media in the early 90s for any sort of questioning youth. But also, Chasing Amy is a great flick. I'll die on that hill. That even with the problems in that movie, even if today something like that would feel tame or cringe, it was an honest portrayal of someone learning about queer identity in the 90s and struggling with these feelings of inadequacy and learning to accept lifestyles and identities that weren't the norm at this time in history. Would that movie be better if it was told from the queer perspective rather than a cis white guy? Sure, absolutely. I would love to see Chasing Amy that literally just focuses on Amy, but that doesn't mean every viewing of Chasing Amy needs to revolve around pointing out all the flaws in this 30-year-old film. Made by a guy whose career is based off of stoner drug dealers who are obsessed with X-Men. It's fine to enjoy these flicks. I'm giving you permission, and so is Jane. I mentioned that this film is mainly about sex, and that is entirely true. Horror movies and media are used to portray a larger theme of sex and intimacy throughout this film, whatever that may look like and whatever body that may be in. Horror horror movies is actually a pretty great proxy for sex, and Jane uses the imagery of phallic weapons, final girls, and copious amounts of fluids flowing to great effect in realizing these themes. As much as this movie wants you to feel okay with liking the problematic horror movies of your youth, it also wants you to accept the raw awkwardness of sex and pleasure. I won't go too deep into these themes because one of YouTube, and mainly, frankly, though, because they aren't ones that resonate with a monogamous cis dude like myself, and they aren't really my themes to dissect. They exist in this film and are told beautifully throughout, and are for some, no doubt, they may act as an awakening to a life they didn't know they could have. Much like Chris states the original Camp Miasma was a sexual awakening for her. But for me, all I'll say is that is the main theme of this film, and it's told beautifully under the guise and homage to these beautiful horror movies that we all grew up loving. Jane now has three feature films under their belt, and Camp Miasma is by far their most ambitious and, in my opinion, their most approachable. Though approachable is relevant when talking about this particular filmmaker. What they have done in their short amount of time in Hollywood has been a treat to watch, with each film offering greater discussion and larger themes to dissect and contextualize. We have some very interesting filmmakers emerging, especially in horror right now, but I don't think anyone is as interesting or maybe even as masterful at their craft as Jane. Whatever they do next, be it the novel they're working on, the Netflix adaptation, or another deeply personal story relating to the media that shaped who they have now become, I'll be there day one, and you should be too. Jane is a special director, and there's someone we should continue to watch. Thank you guys for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.